Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Today I am at home with a compassionate partner, Paul, and I have two kids, two very wild, lively kids, a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. So if you see them bop in, forgive me for that. It's wonderful to be with the Southeast Synod. I have a special connection to your Synod and to Atlanta in particular. I am a proud graduate of Candler School of Theology in Atlanta at Emory. And while I was studying there and while Paul was studying in the business school, we were members at St. John's on Ponce. And so it's a real pleasure to be here with my former pastor, Bradley, and now he is a dear, dear friend. As we begin a Zoom conference, I think it's just important to note that based on life circumstances, some of you might be multitasking right now, and I fully support that. I think as somebody who is a parent of a young child, much of these past few years has been spent multitasking. So if you're making breakfast or fixing the kitchen sink or whatever you're doing, know that I see you, I support you, and however you're showing up is absolutely enough for today. I am going to invite, we've got a nice group gathered, and so I'm going to invite lots of conversation over the course of the next 45 minutes. And I invite you to drop questions into the chat, and hopefully somebody can help me see those along the way. But as we begin, I wonder if you all either want to type into the chat who you are and where you're joining from, or if you just want to shout it out, that's fine too, if that's more comfortable.
I couldn't get my laptop to have any sound or anything.
Hey, Gwen, this is Pastor Michael. We can hear you.
I think it's easier for us. We're at Ascension Lutheran Church here in Chattanooga.
All right. Wonderful. Thanks so much. Lots of the Southeast Synod represented, which is really fun. All right, before we launch, I wanted to just offer a little bit of a content warning. I'm deeply aware that the conversation about trauma, particularly as we talk about racialized trauma, affects bodies differently. So people who inhabit Black and brown bodies bear a weight that others of us who occupy white bodies do not. That weight is compounded by historical and generational trauma, and I think it's just important to name that as we start this conversation. I have attempted to be super judicious with the images and the language that I'm using as we talk about the police murder of George Floyd, but even so, I recognize that this conversation triggers us in different ways. So I want to say that as we begin. I took a course this past year with Resma Menachem, who is the author of My Grandmother's Hands, a book I highly recommend to you if you haven't explored it. And he often in the class invited us to pause, breathe, and then shake our hips. Shaking our hips as a way to remind ourselves that we don't have to hold it all, and we in fact can't hold it all, that God holds it for us. And if that practice helps you today, I invite you to use it along the way. Pause, breathe, shake your hips. All right. I'm going to share my screen and show some images along the way here. All right. So I've been invited here today, I think, because in May of 2020, the night after George Floyd was murdered by police in Minneapolis, I got a call at home. The caller invited me to turn on the television and look at the images that were unfolding there around the 3rd Precinct building, the issuing precinct for the officers who were involved in Mr. Floyd's murder. And righteous anger and tear gas already filled the streets in equal measure, and that was playing out on the news. And fires, small at the time, dotted the screen that I was looking at. Protesters with cardboard signs stood face to face with police in riot gear. And there on the corner of the screen was the church that I serve, Holy Trinity. The caller asked me if the church would consider opening our doors to serve as the medic station for the community, particularly for wounded demonstrators. And police were using flashbangs and rubber bullets and tear gas quite liberally at that moment in time, which intensified the injuries that were being suffered by people who were showing up in the street. And to be honest, it was a big ask at that moment in time. Our church doors had been shut, like hermetically sealed shut because of COVID-19. And we were taking our commitment seriously to slow the spread of the disease. But then this twin pandemic of systemic racism showed up on our doorstep, and we were asked to find a way into a future that we had quite literally never imagined for ourselves. I was 8 months pregnant at the time, and I had a 2-year-old sleeping upstairs. And when I hung up the phone and I looked at my husband, he asked me one question: do you think that this is a good idea? And I'm not exactly sure how I responded, but it was something to the effect of, I'm not sure, but I think that this is the call of the church at this moment in time. So I quickly rang up pastor colleagues and church, a handful, very limited number of church leaders, and had some discussion about whether or not we should do this. And then with everybody's agreement, I called one congregant who I assumed would already be protesting in the area and who I knew had a church key. Turns out he was already protesting in the area and he had the church key in his pocket. And so he opened up the doors, and about 20 minutes later, we were serving as the medic station for the neighborhood. And as soon as those doors were propped and Bob started getting things ready along with a whole bunch of other people who would help out during those days, I put on a maternity clergy shirt and a face mask that we were all wearing in those days, and running shoes. And I just was flooded with uncertainty as I drove over to the church. And I want to be really clear, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. And maybe that's the basis of evangelism. We have absolutely no idea what we're doing. None of my seminary courses or community organizing classes or de-escalation trainings prepared me for that moment. And as I drove, all these questions flooded my brain. And I suspect if you were in a similar situation, the questions would flood yours too. What if somebody was hurt on our property? What if the building went up in flames? Do we have what demonstrators need? Is there another group that's better suited to serve in this way? What will the rest of the congregation think? Because I had only talked to about like 2 or 3 congregants before we decided to do this. What will the neighborhood think? What will our insurance company think? What if we're stormed by police? Will there be weapons in the church building? How will we mitigate COVID? Is this illegal? Do I care if it's illegal? How much tear gas is too much tear gas for pregnant women? All of those questions and many, many others went unanswered in those early days. And for several days and nights, the church tended to wounded and despairing demonstrators. And in those days and nights, most of the buildings, practically all of the buildings west of us burned to the ground. And after the fires died down and the smoke cleared, then we became a basic necessities and food distribution center for the neighborhood, because we had gone from being this food-rich community to being a food desert overnight. So thousands of cars lined up, and they brought food and water and plywood, saws, diapers, formula, soap, hand sanitizer, and other necessities that were no longer available to our neighborhood. Over the course of that summer, we served multiple times a week, offering food and basic necessities. And our numbers kept growing and growing. So we had to scale up our operations really quickly. And just to be very clear, we had never served as a food shelter before. So this was a lot of new learning on the fly. And our deacon, David Rojas Martinez, estimates that we served about 40,000 households in those first few months. So that's sort of like the background story of how I come into this space today. One could say that was one long traumatic event, or one could say that it was hundreds of or thousands of traumatic events, one on the heels of another. And my classmate Kim Wagner, who is an Emory grad, now she's at Princeton. She'll soon publish a book on trauma and preaching, and I think it's a very helpful resource. She says that it's important to distinguish between a traumatic event, which she says has a beginning and a middle and an end, and a traumatic experience. Because a traumatic experience lingers well after the traumatic event is over. Kim says that trauma has this disorienting capacity, that it's difficult to make sense of traumatic events and even harder to make meaning out of them. So that rings particularly true of my experience. And unless you have slept through the last 3 years of racial reckoning and COVID-19, I suspect that it might connect with you too. So I am using this presentation sort of selfishly this morning to try to make some sense out of traumatic events and experiences that linger even now in the wake of this. As we all know, trauma can fracture communities, and I certainly have experienced that over the course of the last few years. But it also can break open communities and lead us, kind of shake us up, reorient us in a way that leads toward abundant life. And that's where I kind of want to focus our time for the rest, for the rest of our time together. And I'm going to name 3 ways that I think that this moment in time that in this moment in time, our sense of the church and evangelism is being broken open, shaken loose, reoriented for the sake of the world that God envisioned. Okay, so that's a background. Any questions before I jump into the first way that I think we're being shaken up.
I have a question.
right.
This is Pastor Michael.
Yeah.
What was the most radical thing you did before this? Just
Personally
to,
or congregationally?
congregationally, I just, a lot of us were kind of stuck and we're kind of very scared to step out of bounds. And I just
Yeah.
wonder, what were some things that y'all might have done before this that were,
Yeah.
that you might have said, oh, this is pretty radical for us. And then this is obviously a major step. And it's not, anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah. That's a great question, and I'll address some of that in the three things that I think are being shaken up. But I think we had not done anything that would rise to even a baby level of what this experience was like. But that said, so like the congregation has long been involved in like public action and takes our commitment to being the public church really seriously. And we had for a decade and more been really intentionally working on issues related to race and culture. A lot of conversation about tools like the Intercultural Development Inventory, power, privilege, whiteness, white supremacy. So we had been doing some of the heart work. We're still doing that heart work because there's a long ways to go. But we had sort of been, I think, cultivating a community in which I could be confident as a community leader that when we made the decision to open the doors, that the community would support us in that. So there was a sense of cultivation, and certainly we've done a lot of public actions, but nothing. I doubt. I think this will be the most sort of significant action that the congregation may ever do. So,
Well, thank
yeah.
you. I wasn't trying to put you on the spot. I think it's good for us to hear because, like, sometimes these things aren't incremental changes. Sometimes they're just they're right in they fall right in our lap, and we respond. So, thank you.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful. Yeah, I think it's both. All right. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about. So after I graduated from Candler, I needed to spend a year in-house at a Lutheran seminary. It was part of the, like the stamp of approval in terms of ordination process. And during that year, I took a course in Lutheran confessions, which required me to memorize a variety of portions of the small catechism. And I can remember taking these long walks, long romantic walks with my husband, Paul, and reciting sweet nothings that began with the words, "We are to fear and love God so that." And to be honest, I rarely return to the small catechism. I am not the teacher of confirmation in my current context, so I don't go back to the small catechism very often, and I can count on actually 0 hands the number of times I've thought about the office of the keys since that class. That is, until I got thinking about this presentation. I mentioned that when we were asked to open our church doors at the start of the uprising, I called a member who I thought would already be there and have a church key in his pocket. And Bob is one of the members at Holy Trinity who locks the building after worship on Sunday morning, so he's granted a church key. I've heard so many stories in clergy circles, some humorous and some really uncomfortable and some painful about who gets church keys and how they are used. I suspect if we polled all of you, you'd have different practices around that. Some communities have strict rules, issuing only a few keys at a time. Others that give church keys to leaders each year and they never take them back. So eventually the whole congregation has one. And yet others, like in the rural community that I grew up in, there are churches that have a key, in the flower pot or under the mat, and everybody in town knows where it is. So why even lock the building? So to be clear, each of these church key scenarios makes insurance agents absolutely crazy. They want to like crawl into a hole when they hear about like who has access to the building. So in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and in the midst of the fires that engulfed our neighborhood, church keys were flying this way and that, and we were giving keys to anyone who asked for one. Milk needed to be stored in the fridge, mops and tarps needed to be found in the basement. Spaces were needed for prayer and for respite in the building, and doors often needed reinforcing. So we gave a key to anyone who asked for one, whether it was a member or stranger. I didn't need to know the person. There was really no other choice for us in that moment in time, and many would call that behavior reckless. And it was reckless. I don't know about you, but from an early age, I was conditioned to play through all the possibilities before taking on something new. I learned to conduct these thorough cost benefit analyses in all areas of life, you name it, dating or education or employment or volunteerism or philanthropy. Many of the communities that raised me deemed this sort of analysis to be prudent or shrewd and faithful and rewarded me for it. I think discernment is a sacred gift. Don't hear me incorrectly here. I do think discernment is a sacred gift. Like all things, though, all good things, it has an underbelly. And I think that those of us with privilege, and I'll just speak for myself here, in churches, unearned privilege, cite discernment as a reason to slow things down, deliberate from every angle, in order to ensure that we choose the best outcome. And I think that oftentimes this actually is an exercise in control. Resmaa Menakem, who I mentioned earlier, the author of My Grandmother's Hand, says that one way that white bodies work is that white body supremacy influences or determines many of the decisions we make, the options we select, the choices that are available to us, and how we make those decisions and choices. And this operating system affects all of us, whether we recognize it or not. I think relatively few white Americans consciously recognize, let alone embrace this subtle variety of supremacy. In fact, there's really no way to measure it or to recognize it, says Menakem. So when my neighborhood was in flames, and we were called on to respond, it was, I think, discernment's shadow that said to me, Ingrid, you better wait for the next church leadership meeting before you open those doors. You better wait for the next church council meeting before you open those doors. And thankfully, my colleagues said, now is a time to resist calculation and simply go. So back to the Small Catechism for just 1 second. The office of the keys in Luther's Small Catechism is grounded in the words from Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus says, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Most of our communities are well practiced at binding and a little rusty at loosening. The opportunities, I think, are there for us to practice this move toward metaphorically giving the keys away for the sake of the world that God envisions. And I'd love to hear from others of you as we take a pause here. I'd love to hear you reflect on, in this moment in time, what do you feel like your church is binding? And what is your church letting loose? Or said another way, if those phrases don't mean anything to you, what are you being invited to give away? What sort of power are you being invited to give away for the sake of the world that God envisions? I'm going to stop sharing for a second so we can just have a little bit of conversation.
This is Pastor Michael. I'll say, even though I'm in a Synod context, I help oversee all of our youth events. And so just little example, last week, we were at St. Timothy Lutheran Church in Hendersonville, Tennessee, and we had about 60 youth present and had folks sign up to be worship helpers. And to someone like me, that's just something you naturally do. Those are some of those keys you give away. And I know that's inside the church, but it's amazing to hear. I think 5 of the 15 that we had said, we're not allowed to do this, So it could be as simple as giving them that permission in a safe space to do a thing. And that was odd. And then in a bigger scale, during an Easter sermon one time, I had mentioned that I had a conversation with the imam who was in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Went over to the mosque, had a conversation with him, and he mentioned something about, people are worried that we're here to convert everybody to Islam. He goes, we tell the story and it's up to God to do the converting. And I thought, well, that'll preach. So I mentioned that in the sermon on Easter Sunday, and I got a little pushback afterwards, but I said, that's kind of our story. Like we tell a story and it's up to God to do the converting and the Spirit to change our hearts and minds. And that unlocked a lot of things for our folks. So they were really binding to this, anti-Muslim view in our community. And anyway, lots of good things came out of that, but I'll just stop there.
Great example.
I'm Pastor Patty Axel, and I was thinking about the images we have a tough time unbinding. Our images of a God who is white or a God who is male, and how hard it is. And I tend to push, especially on the female God. And I went to ITC for much of my seminary. So to me, Black Jesus makes perfect sense. But to many of my friends and family and, church members, that's not something that people feel comfortable with. So I think our images and some of our rules about how things are supposed to be, we need to encourage people. And it's a hard journey to go on, but gently, or maybe not so gently sometimes, encourage people to let loose, spread their hands out and try to let go a little bit. So.
Yeah, I thank you for that. I appreciate that. We are currently in a conversation about our stained glass window images at Holy Trinity, and how they tell folks in seminary, like, don't ever change the church carpet. It's just going to cause too much turmoil. Well, you ain't seen nothing until you talk about the stained glass windows. Yeah.
Chris Hermanson at Epiphany in Suwanee, Georgia. Right before COVID shut everything down, we were trying to start a partnership with a local group home in the area, and predominantly individuals with autism. And we talked about trying to partner with them whether they needed to do, some service to the community, they'd help out around the building or whatever, and, invite them to worship. And I remember the director, the founder of the program, she said, "Are you sure you want to do that? Are you sure you want these people in your worship services, in your congregations? Because they're so disruptive." And to think that somebody lives with that all the time. And Epiphany does have a strong community of individuals with autism who are just part of the church. But for a lot of folks, that for somebody to lead a program and to think, you really don't want these people here because they're so difficult and so challenging, that's a structure that needs to be changed, because obviously that is deeply rooted if it's coming from a person who leads a group that helps those folks.
I'm Pastor Marjorie Kiter in Slovak Science Synod. I'm up in Northeast Pennsylvania. I'm thinking that maybe as Lutherans, we've bound our bodies. The Word became flesh, incorporated, and we worship so structured and so still.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Wow, nice. Thank you all. Okay. I'm going to jump into two last things, and we'll have some more conversation along the way. Share. All right. All right. Okay. So a few days after the fires began, a man approached me carrying a lantern. You see that this is an actual photo of him and his lantern. And he introduced himself as Brian Dragonfly, and he was associated with MIGAZ, which was the Indigenous Youth Empowerment Agency that was located right across the alley from us. MIGAZ's building survived, I think, the first night or two of fires, but eventually fire jumped from a neighboring building, and MIGAZ's building, which they had just completed maybe no more than 6 months prior, burned to the ground and all of its content. And when Brian Dragonfly arrived the morning after their building had burned to assess the situation, the building was still burning, and he decided to capture the fire, he told me, as he lifted up his lantern and showed me what was in it. And he asked, would Holy Trinity Lutheran Church tend the fire for MIGAZ until they could rebuild their building. And he thought that the fire might bring some comfort to their community in the weeks and months and actually years ahead. And when he approached, I was actually doing an interview with a New York Times reporter, and she's the one who snapped these photos. So into our sanctuary we went, and he set the lantern on the altar, and I ran to find a candle. And we shared the fire along with the just discussion of trauma from the preceding days, and the conviction that not everything that had burned was to be mourned, and the hope that this ashy moment somehow in our neighborhood's life would be an opportunity for new life. And later that day, I decided to bring the flame home to my house. I was more than a little fire conscious in those days, knowing that our building was one of the only buildings left. And so I put the candle from the church in my car's cup holder and then just prayed it all the way home to my house. And when I got to my house, I wept because it occurred to me that even shattered dreams need tending. And so that's what we've been doing for these past 2 years. This fire has been burning in members' homes, and each week 2 members host the fire, and over time, the fire keepers have figured out these best practices, consulting with Roman Catholics about long burning candles and testing out different lanterns for transport and learning from precarious windy situations along the way as they moved from house to house. And the group of congregants who tend this fire has grown over the course of time. And they are committed to keeping this fire going until Migazi's building is in its new location, which hopefully will be sometime this spring or summer. And at that time, Kelly Drummer, their executive director, will consult with elders, Indigenous elders, about how and where and what to do with the flame and how to extinguish it. I guess the question is whether to extinguish it. So I tell this story because it feels to me like a lot of the past years have been a practice in saying yes, and then figuring out exactly what that means and how we're going to make it work. And I admit that it's not a natural posture for me, nor is it, I think, a natural posture for the congregation that I serve. And perhaps some of you can relate to that too. Saying yes when the community calls more often than not is a move away from things like domination and control. And just yesterday, I read a lead study that interviewed BIPOC church leaders from around the country. And their reflection was that they found that white people act like the Good Samaritan right up until the point that it costs them something. So saying yes costs something, which is why I suspect that many folks who find themselves in places of privilege in church life are circumspect with their yeses. So a couple of resources that I think about when I think about saying yes. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to read Sharon Welch's The Feminist Ethic of Risk, but she talks about this. Welch says that those who engage in justice struggles, like all of us, always do so from a position of incomplete understanding with a limited perspective. We can't know the ending before we begin. And it's impossible to control or to guarantee the outcome or success of a particular action. And so Welch invites us to sort of into this an ethic of risk that is characterized by 3 different elements. A redefinition of responsible action. So what seems reckless might actually be the right choice. Grounding in community, and here I'd say particularly a community that's far larger than any one of our church communities. And she also asks people to consider taking on strategic risk taking, beginning before we know how the story will end. And those are hard moves for me. I suspect they're hard moves for you all, and even harder when we're trying to do something together as a community. One other resource, I'm not sure if any of you listen to Kate Bowler's podcast, Everything Happens, but she recently had a conversation with a small town funeral director that I really admire, Thomas Lynch. And Lynch, he's also a writer. He wrote the book, The Undertaking, and I pull that book out far more often than the Small Catechism, if that says anything. And in the podcast interview, Lynch said something that I think resonates with this move towards saying yes. He said, an undertaking is a pledge to get a job done. In that sense, the undertaking is an agreement between you and the community you serve that you'll show up and do the work when the need arises, not only when it's convenient for you. So with that, my question for us just to spend a few minutes on is, will we say yes when we prefer to say no? Will we take risks even when they cost us something? Will we show up for our communities, not only when it's convenient, but when need arises? And here I'm going to just stop sharing the screen and say, maybe you all have an example or two of a way that this has played out in your community and we can learn from one another. When have you said yes and taken a risk in doing so? Or maybe the question is, have you said yes and taken a risk in doing so?
So, Ingrid, Melissa Fuller, Assistant to the Bishop, DEM. When you were mentioning the questions that you were thinking at the very beginning, I could so resonate with that. And I think too often that has bound my congregation and caused for much delay and have allowed us to, or caused us to miss opportunities. So I thank you for saying yes, because quite frankly, I just don't, if my church was in your church in that area, I just don't think we would have said yes. I think we would have been so much wrestling with all of the questions and delay after delay after delay, missing the opportunity to serve. So I appreciate and thank you and your congregation and the community for saying yes and being present and taking risk that turned out to benefit many. The other thing I wanted to ask a question, or I ponder, what do you say to so many of our loving Lutherans? That we have some great people that serve. Let me say that first, that are front and center and that advocate for people and really serve the community. But what do you say to Lutherans that perhaps would say, those people would not have been injured had they not been there present? Police have a job to do, and they were doing their job. So, there's no need to open the door because, quite frankly, they shouldn't have been there, or they should have gone home, and they wouldn't have encountered what they encountered. Do you have thoughts about that question?
Yeah. Oh boy, good one. Good one, Melissa. I think it is that question is one that a lot of our communities are asking, predominantly white communities that have had fewer engagements with a system that statistically, I mean, we can point to sort of statistical fact that when it comes to what we might term systemic justice that plays out in police departments, we can see statistically that there is how do I want to say it? There's a racial gap, a racialized gap between who is served and who is harmed in communities like Minneapolis. And Minneapolis, for instance, is a city that is trying to engage some of those questions. But I think as people of faith, we get so caught up in in wanting to, I'm trying to think about how it plays out in my own context, and hopefully that helps in how it plays out in other contexts. I think we struggle with telling the truth about some of the racialized gaps in America. The church struggles to talk about those things. And it's one place where we can speak to the truth and say, this is a reality in our community, a systemic reality, and it's one that we ought to be addressing. So I think to name that the murder of George Floyd was not an anomaly, it's part of a pattern, not just in Minneapolis, but across the country. That anti-Blackness is a part of the American story. And how do we, as people of faith, start to speak about that in ways that don't close us down into shame and blame, but break us open to be, evangelists of abundant life. And to the question about, the protesters shouldn't have been there. One of the anonymous lines that was circulating in the community in those first days after the police murder of George Floyd was when he called out for his mama, all mamas were summoned, all mothers were summoned. And I think we need to go back to the starting point about the belovedness of life and keep pointing back to the goodness and belovedness of a man who was, crucified in broad daylight at 38th in Chicago, and say, because of our belief in the belovedness of humanity, and particularly of this person, all of us are summoned. When we see this unfold, all of us, and the mama thing resonated with me, being a mama, but all of us are summoned in our own way, and that's true in our communities across the country. So yeah, that's a long answer, but thanks for the question, Melissa. If you have any follow-up, I'd love it.
I think in a slightly different context, when I served in Florida, you talked about taking risk, and we made a decision down in Cocoa Beach to open our church to the homeless, and we had numerous programs for them. That it was great because, and it wasn't just let's do something for them, as we became friends with them, and over the years we were able to help them to get into rehab and get their lives back, because it's no fun living on the street. We don't want to support that. I mean, we did support them when they were on the street and they didn't want to get off. Some people didn't want to get off, but a lot of people were just really desperate. And here's what I would share is that what we found was, by doing that, we met Christ, because these folks were people that brought Christ into our midst and into our presence. And it really revitalized our church. And that's where evangelism came in, because we got to see that, God was working through these folks. And as we reached out to them, they ministered to us. We got a lot more from them than they got from us. And that was really an amazing thing for our congregation. It really opened us up, because now it was not so much about, hey, let's protect this space. It was more about, how can this space do ministry? Because we had just built a new ministry center, and we're like, hey, we got to open this place up. And it really made a huge difference. So I think it is important. I'm just commenting, it is important to take that risk and open up a little bit and take chances.
Thank you. I think that's a good lead in to the last piece that I want to share. Okay. So yeah, to your point, evangelism as mutual aid, and what does that teach us? about evangelism. So you saw the pictures of food and basic necessities pouring into the neighborhood that I shared at the start of this conversation, and thousands of cars and trucks and vans and even a few semis lined up with diapers and formula and canned goods and granola bars, tampons and Depends, plywood and nails, all the things, even the things that we didn't want. They showed up at the door. And those of you who have lived through personal or social or natural disasters know that the floodgates of generosity seem to open up in the wake of trauma. So people who seemed immovable, once immovable, spring into action, and we see neighbors check on neighbors, and book clubs and block parties call for donations. We see students organize petitions, or one of my favorites, covered dishes, or what we call hot dishes or casseroles in the Midwest, up here on doorsteps. You know, people share all sorts of things. I did get to thinking that in more agricultural communities, like the one that I grew up in, and some of you may occupy smaller town environments, we see this play out in the fields a lot. And many years ago, I read a book by Kent Myers that was entitled The Witness of Combines. And he talks about the year that his father died. And his father died after the corn was planted and before it was harvested. And he talks about the mutual aid that flowed out in the wake of his father's death. And I just want to lift that up as an experience of how we see this play out in more rural communities. When the moment came, corn and community ripe at the same time, there appeared in our driveway combines and trucks coming along the long gradual slope from the county road, raising dust. We could have harvested the corn ourselves, though it would have been difficult with school in session. We could have hired the work done. But harvest is everything on the plains, the summation of all the effort, the gauge of all knowledge and judgment. And the combines came as a communal action out of respect for my father and acknowledgement of his passing, and a healing gesture from the human communal heart. I think that mutual aid is a part of our faith story. In Acts, we hear about all things being held in common. And in 1 Corinthians, Paul instructs the community saying, when one suffers, all suffer. When one rejoices, all rejoice. And I dare say that this is even more than purchasing a pack of diapers for a church when all hell breaks loose, or tending the flame for a neighboring organization, or showing up with our combines when disaster strikes. Our faith calls us to go deeper and a little bit further. And I think faith calls us to ask how a single pack of diapers, for instance, might break open a different understanding of the world. To wonder, as we watch those flames dance, how power could be redistributed so that people can live abundant lives. Or to explore how a day spent in a neighbor's field might reorient our understanding of how the individual and community interact. I think Anabaptists have spent a lot of time with questions like these, and we have a lot to learn. In fact, Martin Luther was not terribly adept at asking these questions. So we have to pick up the baton on this one. And my friend Isaac Villegas, who's a Mennonite in Durham, North Carolina, says that, quote, mutual aid is our transformation from glory into the fullness of God's life for us. It is the incarnation of divine care. So just to think about mutual aid as evangelism, I think is a helpful image for us. And I'd be remiss to Jay's point if I didn't say that mutual aid means that we too recognize our own vulnerabilities and our own needs. We aren't always meant to be the evangelist. I looked like this. This picture on the screen is what I looked like in May of 2020, and my very pregnant body often stopped people in their tracks. Strangers would offer me a bottle of water or hand me a chair. And once, when tensions really overflowed at food distribution and people kind of stormed, hundreds of people stormed the food distribution just out of fear of scarcity. A few people, I can remember a few people standing around me and hooking their elbows so that I wouldn't be pushed down by the crowd. My colleague, Pastor Angela Kabeb, calls the baby that is internal at that point, baby BLM, because he was with us at the start of the movement. But baby BLM reminded me and others of our own vulnerability and reminded us that we needed one another as well. So a couple last sentences before we're out of time, probably. I've spent this time talking about evangelism in the wake of trauma, and I don't think I've actually defined what evangelism is. And going back to the beginning, I'm not sure that I know how to define it or that I even should. But that said, if I were going to say where all of these fragments, trauma fragments, lead me in this moment, it's to a question. And I think it is the question, it's the question that I hold on to in terms of what evangelism means in this moment in the church's life. And it's from Ellen Davis, who's at Duke. She's a professor of Bible and practical theology, and she uses the question in a different context, but I hold on to it for the work of evangelism. And it is this. The question is, can you love what you do not control? And I think that's a question that we in the church should wrestle with a little bit in the next chapter of our lives. Can you love what you do not control? So, and when I say we should wrestle with it, I include myself in that category because I don't have it. So, all right, I think that's all from me, but I'd welcome any comments or questions, or pass the baton over to Bradley.
Thank you so much, Pastor Ingrid, for, this a number of times, excuse me, you have brought me to a point of weeping, thinking that I had gotten fairly jaded thinking about the condition of the church and where we're headed. But this brings back that hope that there are many people who get it. And even if we don't get it, we're trying. So I really seriously appreciate your input in the questions you have put up in front of us to think about. Any other comments or questions? I'm so glad we recorded this because I want to make sure everybody goes back and listens and watches. And go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
I really appreciate the question of cost in relation to the Samaritan story. I think, in our context here, we're doing so many things. There's all kinds of different ministry teams doing to a point. And it's about trusting in the Spirit enough to go past that point, discomfort and challenge and transformation, we'll have a ministry that provides food, or a ministry that provides, a care kit and things like that. We're good at doing something, but being someone, that next thing, I think is really what the Holy Spirit is working in the hearts of people here, because everybody's kind of saying we need to do more, like they're wanting to do more, but they're not sure what that more looks like. And maybe that's okay.
Can I add one thing to the discussion too here? I think to not discount the power of the little ways we say yes along the way, building practices of hospitality, creating a welcome that is genuine and wide, and being able to practice facing challenge in all the little ways we do as churches, that I think we probably have ways to say yes every day, every week. And I think those matter. And I think we could discount those, thinking they're not enough. But they could well be the seeds that lead to the possibility of a big yes later. Because I think a lot of this has to do with kairos, and both those little daily, weekly, ongoing practices matched with an openness to the kairos moment, that those really get paired together to create the circumstances that led to Pastor Ingrid saying, here's the keys. Knowing her the way I do, and knowing how this wasn't just overnight getting up and saying, okay, I'm going to take a right turn here that I've never taken before, knowing how she has been embodying these things from the very beginning of her ministry, not just at this place, but even in her own education, and the kind of things that she was willing to be open to along the way.
This is Pastor Michael again. I was on this app called TikTok. I don't know if you've heard of it. I was on last night, and Pastor Jenny Sung, who's one of the ELCA young adult contributors to that TikTok, she somebody else was on doing a TikTok, and she was on there with them, and they said the speed of the leader, speed of the pack, and sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. But the point they were making was, for us as, maybe called leaders or appointed leaders or elected leaders, or however you want to put it, sometimes just being in the spaces helps give other people permission to be there too. Not that we're the ones that have it all. Trust me, I understand that. But sometimes they do look to anybody who's leading, or it might be your evangelism team, might be whoever, but just showing up in some of those spaces gives other people permission almost. I mean, not that they need it. I've said this before in another meeting before, but yeah, and I don't know how to make it sound like not self-centered, but it's sort of like sometimes just showing up and embodying presence is all that's needed, right? It's not necessarily us, but sometimes it is us. And we're called to just, I don't know, be in the spaces sometimes. And we don't have to have the loudest voice. We don't have to, be the biggest presence, but just simply showing up is huge. And that's what helped the congregation I was leading, be a part of things in the community. It was just sometimes just show up, and then others show up. And then I can take a step back, and then they start showing up more and more. And anyway, just wanted to share that.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Nice to be with you. And I'll keep your congregations in my prayers in the coming days, and trust that you'll do the same for those of us up in the snowy north right now. Thanks so much.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you. Let's take a short break. How about, well, it's 11:16. Come back at 25 after. So move, stretch, biological break, whatever you need, new cup of coffee, and then we will welcome Bradley into our space. Well, welcome back. We are looking forward to the second half of our Ignite Evangelism Conference, brought to you by Pastor Bradley Schmeling from Gloria Dei Lutheran Church in St. Paul. And what we were thinking initially, except that Pastor Ingrid just blew away way more than I was ever even hoping we would talk about. So I can only imagine what Bradley will be bringing. The thinking about worship and how our worship can heal and can reach out into the community. So Bradley, obviously, anybody who's been in the Southeastern Synod for very long remembers Bradley being the pastor of St. John's. And so we are delighted to have him come back with us and share his expertise and his presence and all that good stuff. So Bradley, it's all yours.
Thank you. And just what an honor to be with all of you and to see some of you who I know again, and some of you who I haven't yet gotten to know. Glad that you're all spending a Saturday morning doing this. I know that is a huge sacrifice to take time on Saturday to do churchy things. And let me also say just what an honor it is to follow Pastor Ingrid, who I've known for so many years now. There's a group of us in the Twin Cities that call ourselves the Atlanta Posse. It's 4 different couples who sort of 2 by 2 left the Southeastern Synod in the Atlanta and moved to the Twin Cities. And before COVID, we got together pretty regularly. We need to get back to our pattern again. But over the years, Ingrid has really become one of my teachers, and I've just overwhelmed by her witness in the last presentation and feeling my own. I found myself feeling a lot of emotion during that, which was a little surprising to me. And I wonder if it's part of my own experiential memory of those times. I'm reticent to name my experience as trauma because it's so small compared to what many experience, not just in that event, but through regular systemic experiences of wounding. But we live 4 blocks from 38th and Chicago. So when George Floyd was murdered, it was very much a neighborhood experience here. I have such vivid memories of, well, one, just sitting on the front porch when we got the news alert that another Black man had been murdered in Minneapolis, and Darren and I talking about that, not yet realizing that that was just 4 blocks from our house. But then over the next series of days, being able to hear the crowds gathering in that place, and then waking up to the smell of smoke that permeated our house, and there were ashes and things in our backyard that had fallen from the sky that night, and then going into the lockdown, and at the same time trying to figure out how to be pastor in a congregation not quite far in some ways, but in other ways quite distant from the experience of Holy Trinity on Lake Street, not just because of the Minneapolis-St. Paul divide, but just our cultural context, our economic realities that exist in our two places. But and it made me go back while she was talking to, I hadn't planned on sharing some of these. Can I be a screen sharer? May I have permission to share the screen, please?
Apologies right away.
No problem. Okay, here we go. Let's see. I have to get my Zoom skills back again. It's been a while since I'm doing this here. It made me go back and search through my pictures, and this is relevant to the topic I want to kind of delve into, which is the role of ritual, and for us, liturgy, in the face of deep human experience, in the face of trauma. I think ritual is one of the places where we have the potential to grapple with the deep kinds of questions that sometimes we can't even name yet in our mind, but are struggling with. And so this is a picture of 38th and Chicago, just probably the next day after George Floyd was murdered. And so you see what's happening almost immediately. People are beginning to ritualize this moment, which is an attempt to cast cast chaos inside of a larger story. This continues to this day. The intersection there, although somewhat open now to traffic, still has an area set aside where he was murdered, and people continue to come there. And it really feels like sacred space in the neighborhood. There's just another picture. And over the days, it just grew and grew and grew until eventually it became people were planting gardens, and there was a circle set up in the middle of the street, which is still there with a raised fist, and the names of Black men who've been murdered painted for blocks leading up to the intersection there. It feels like an All Saints prayer. As you name by name by name, you move toward the site where George Floyd was murdered. And the other thing that I thought of is after the uprising and after buildings were burned and there was plywood everywhere along Lake Street and in other places in the Twin Cities, people began to create art on the sides of these burned buildings. And this is an example of a piece that was done. I think about a year later, they had a display in one of the parks where they had collected all of these painted plywood sheets and portrayed them. And again, I feel like this is ritual action to begin to tell a different kind of story that ultimately then has the function of rewriting our story and handling trauma and beginning to heal from trauma. So one body broken for the world is how I'm thinking about this relationship between liturgy and trauma. And just to kind of Ingrid mentioned some of this, but to sort of think about trauma in that distinction that she was mentioning between event and ongoing, that trauma is a lasting emotional response that often results from living through a distressing event. Experiencing a traumatic event can harm a person's sense of safety, sense of self, an ability to regulate emotions and navigate relationships. In a moment, I want to talk about how ritual addresses each of those kind of experiences. And then this next one goes back to all of your, your worship class, that liturgy is the work of the people. It's something we're doing together. Merriam-Webster describes it a customary repertoire of ideas, phrases, or observances. And then vocabulary.com goes a little bit farther, says a liturgy is like a script for a religious service, the official set of rules for performing a religious ceremony. Now, the liturgy nerd would say, I think they're talking about rubrics here. Those are the rules for how you do it, not liturgy itself. But looking at these two things together, one thing that strikes me is that what we're doing in our ritual practice and in the Sunday morning liturgical assembly is a lasting ritual response that often results in an encounter that reframes events, history, and personal communal experience. That's my own little take on putting these two together. So I think ritual could play a really unique role in healing for us because we engage in these practices and this way of making meaning again and again and again. We don't ever assume that one time and done, that we gather weekly because something in us needs to re-encounter this meaning, this transcendence again and again in order to find our place in the world. Let's see. There we go. Just to do a little kind of summary of the kinds of things that ritual does in meeting human needs. And this comes from a book called Ritual and Care of Community, where Elaine Ramshaw is trying to get us to think about, we tend to think of pastoral care as something we do individually, like we sit in an office and do counseling, or we, go visit people. But she wants us to think about our ritual life, our communal life, as also doing the work of nurture and care. And so where ritual does this is that we all have this kind of need for order, for things to make sense to us. And I would just want to often offer the caveat, we all know ritual that does the opposite, rather than meet our need for order, enforces an order, and I think that's always something to keep in mind, that ritual has positive and negative ways of being used, and we probably all have experiences with both of those sides. That it meets our need to reaffirm meaning, to be reminded that we are part of a particular kind of story. And ritual practices will do that in a way that's not just in the mind. Our bodies, our emotions, the aesthetic of ritual places us in a meaning-rich environment, and gives us a story through which we can then frame our own experiences and our own story. Ritual just connects us with each other. And particularly for Lutherans, where Luther's experience of the Mass, moving from the individual priest just saying Mass as a kind of a work, to a communal experience around the means of grace, and that it takes a body of believers in order to experience grace. And so we we get connected to each other. It's hard to worship by yourself. It's by nature a communal project. And then ritual helps us to handle life's ambivalence, that we have conflicting emotions, experiences within us. And ritual can name the good parts of the ambivalence. For example, when we feel revengeful, that ritual privileges love and justice above revenge again and again. So it helps us to rewrite the order of those experiences for us in one way. In another way, it can name that revenge or that negative experience in a way that honors it, but doesn't let it overwhelm. It sets it within the context of love and justice. We can name out loud whatever experience we have, and in that container, it's okay for us to experience it. And then the last is that it provides us with a way to encounter transcendence, something bigger than ourselves, something bigger than our own experience. In Elaine's book, she writes of a newborn baby experiencing the mother's love, absolutely vulnerable, dependent, and the mother says, I see you, I feel you, I hold you. And so this experience that really, we still as adults yearn for that experience of being seen and named. Ingrid, you talked about, we say their names. That's an experience of transcendence, to be valued and loved beyond what we can get in our regular day-to-day life. I want to stop sharing the screen here a minute and just ask all of you, as you think of the power of liturgy and ritual in your communities to heal, or even to get in the way of healing, where do you see that happening in your context when you gather with your communities?
Pastor Michael here. Sorry, I've talked a lot, but this is stirring up lots of images and memories. We had two youth in our community when I was serving in Upper East Tennessee, two brothers who died in a car accident on the way to school. And it was obviously traumatic, and it actually happened while we were at convocation. So we were over at Luther Ridge and called back home. And so wondering, we grieved as a community, we grieved as, with the family. But when we came back to church on Sunday morning, I thought, oh Lord, we didn't really grieve as a church community, like the greater community did that. And, I didn't change the liturgy. We kept whatever random Sunday of the year it was. And as I told the people, I was like, and it was hard for me to make it through, but what helped me was the liturgy, was that steady presence of God through word, through scripture, through prayer. And, as I told the people that day, I was like, this is what's going to get us through today. So sometimes maybe it's just that steady presence of that God is with us here in these words. And that was very powerful. And what seemed like a mundane liturgy was what carried us through the day. So yeah, that was helpful.
And Patty here. I remember back at 9/11, and that week, the Dirk Lang was the associate pastor at St. Matthew, and just called a Tizay service, just a simple, let's get together, anybody who wants to. And we gathered there, didn't have anything particularly planned, but the comfort of gathering together and saying what our fears and, with all of us had, and the sense of unknown, what would happen next, was incredibly comforting, and being in that presence together. So
You made me remember 9/11 when I was at St. John's in Atlanta, and we felt like we need to call the community to pray. But it felt like too much just to gather and just sort of have open prayer or open discussion, so we decided to, we used Holden evening prayer. We thought, well, we can sing together. We don't know what to say, but we can sing together. But then we did have space where people could pray out loud. And one person, Gene Lewis, I don't know if anybody remembers him here, he said, Lord, I don't even want to say this, but you have called us to love our enemies. And I don't know what that means, but I pray for wisdom. And I thought it was such a powerful example of that kind of naming ambivalence, recognizing publicly how none of us were inclined to love our neighbor in that moment. But to say it allowed us to cast it into that bigger frame and say, yeah, that's absolutely right. Other examples of where you have seen ritual working to heal or hold a community.
One thing I didn't say was in the early days of the food distribution, there was a lot of fear around scarcity of resources. And Deacon David and another friend, minister type, had gotten up on tables and started calling out, there is more than enough. And then the crowd would say back, there is more than enough. And then they'd repeat it, there's more than enough, there's more than enough. And it was like, had such a, it could hold the anxiety of the moment, that call and response. And also like bring sort of a sense of like trust in abundance or peace into the situation.
You make me think, Ingrid, too, about part of that affirming meaning and handling ambivalence is about truth telling in ritual too, how we speak truth in order for ritual to have authenticity and integrity. It must speak truth, all human truth. At the same time, not force an assembly into certain attitudes or experiences. Prayers like, we're all happy to be here today, Lord. Or one time I heard a confirmation sermon all about, this is your time to choose the faith. You have freedom to choose the faith. And I remember looking at these, adolescents and thinking, I'm not sure they experience freedom to make this choice. I think there's a lot of parental pressure to make this choice. So use of language is really important in how we name our human experience, and ritualizing that. Your example, Ingrid, is a perfect ritualization of a truth that is beyond our experience. And that's an interesting kind of juxtaposition, because the experience of the assembly at that point was probably there isn't enough. Any other thoughts about kind of the container that ritual liturgy has for you in your context? So before I go to the next section, I just wanted to tell a little story myself about why I feel strongly that liturgy and ritual are key in creating community and managing trauma. It comes from some of my own experience of when I was at St. John's, and some of you know this story just in a nutshell. When I met my husband, Darren, and informed the bishop I was asked to resign from the roster, I said no. Ingrid, that was my yes. I said no, but it was saying yes to something else, which led to a trial and kind of big, messy deal. And at that time, we became aware that many people would be traveling to Atlanta during the days of the trial. And so we were faced with needing to manage that. And some of the initial ideas were that to create protest events at the hotel, outside the hotel where the trial was going to be held. But that didn't seem right to us because it was creating a narrative of us versus them, which we were really trying to be careful about not creating. So we had the idea that worship would be our way to hold everything together as community, and guests to that community navigated through the days of the trial. And so we chose to do it through a Paschal cycle, through a Holy Week cycle. And so the night before the trial began, we did foot washing and welcomed people to the table. And we had invited people from around the country to send strips of cloth with prayers on them. So those were gathered and then offered, and then over the next days were woven into a piece of art. And we invited everybody from the trial to come and be part of that worship service. Unfortunately, the other side, the jury, the attorneys, chose not to participate in that. And then on Friday, we had prayers around the cross, where we laid big wooden cross in the middle of the chancel and sang and prayed together. And it was really a liturgy of lament, to name out loud what people were feeling, what people were experiencing through this trial, not just my experience, but the systemic experiences of GLBTQ people in the church that was being brought forward through this time. And then on Saturday, simply had the church open where people could come and sit and watch and wait and work on that art piece. People wove the strips, together. And then on Sunday morning, we had Easter. We sang all Easter hymns, and at St. John's at the time, we would at the Easter Vigil one time a year did a dance around the altar. It's in a circle there, so we could move in step around the altar. So we did that on that Sunday morning, even though it was like the 5th Sunday after Epiphany or something like that. But we did Easter and sang "This is the Feast of Victory," which again took the experience and brought it into a larger story about what God was doing through all of this, even what God was doing through our experience of trauma and suffering and pain. So it became an example of that. And I don't think we knew ahead that would all work the way it did, but it kind of did. And so that's what's led me to think about ritual, not just as enforcing a worldview, but actually being a reforming element in the world, that it has the power to transform us to do the work of social change and transformation in the world. Any comments about any of that before I jump in? All right, let me then talk about what I really wanted to. I don't know if you've ever seen Tom Long's book on funerals. It's called "Accompany Them with Singing: The Christian Funeral." And I thought about this in the sense of trauma, in that bringing our suffering and our loss and our pain into worship. And he says that a good funeral does these 8 different things, and we should think about all of these elements as we plan a funeral. I want to think about that in a bigger way, to think about how do these elements play out in our regular Sunday morning worship services as a way of holding trauma and loss. So the first thing is charismatic, and I think I've already been talking about that, in the sense that our story is cast into a larger story that we're telling about what God is. And it's this Paschal mystery of suffering and dying and rising, being broken and then shared for the world. It is oblational. In a sense, the oblation means to bring an offering, and like here, maybe it means money, bringing money or resources, but in a sense, it means bringing all of who we are, bringing our full experience into a worship service. Is our full experience named in some kind of way? Or to ask the flip question, whose experience is not being named in how we are doing things or how we are telling the story? And in terms of the funeral, it's the grief, or even sometimes the relief that comes at a death. But how, as we look at our worship services, can we look at it and say the full breadth of human experience is offered here, is brought forward in how we preach, how we pray, how we sing, how we move? And then that flip question, what might we be leaving out? And to Ingrid's points from earlier, thinking that not just as personal experience, but as systemic experience. How are we naming that, praying about it, singing about it? It should be ecclesial. And in this sense, he just means that it's a community that gathers, and a community that recognizes also that it is part of a larger community. We are here in this context, but we are also connected beyond ourselves, and we're already connected to those who might not be here yet or ever be here. So the church as Catholic, as large, and this is a picture of the ELCA, which may not represent the full Catholicity of the church. And again, what does the universal church look like in our contexts? Therapeutic. We connect with each other. There are spaces for connection and healing that also feel safe. And I think this is really an important thing to think about, is how we are safe with one another in community. I think this has to do with language we use. Ingrid began by saying some of this may be triggering. And I think that's important for us to know what kind of language, what kind of movement can be triggering for some, and how are we taking that into account? I experience this right now with the sharing of the peace. It's like nobody really knows what to do, because we recognize that shaking hands is not comfortable for everyone. But others are yearning for that kind of human connection. And I think at Gloria Dei, we haven't figured this out yet, how to give shape and form to what now feels like this awkward moment of sharing the peace. It feels like it's so important, we got to do it. We can't cut it out, which I think has been the choice of some communities, is just to say, during the pandemic, we can't touch, so we won't do it. But it's raised for us the issue around touch that existed even before. The people who were terrified when someone reached out a hand toward them because it meant that they would have to touch that hand. And it brought up their experiences of abuse, or people on the spectrum talked about the difficulty and dread of the sharing the peace moment. So to me, just sharing the peace can be an example of how we think about, talk about, and then embody just a simple ritual act, where all of our trauma is now present in it, right? Because we just don't know how to be human with each other after coming back from this. Eucharistic, that we need to share a meal with each other. And I won't say much more about that, because I think we understand the power of Eucharistic moment on Sunday mornings, and our church has really moved back into the fullness of word and sacrament over the years. I think Tom Long here is writing to communities who've really dropped out Eucharist. But what I would add to this is Eucharist as fully welcoming. What does it mean to genuinely, fully embody the welcome that comes from Christ at the table? And again, think about our patterns of sharing Eucharist right now also are shaped by the pandemic still in many places. And at Gloria Dei, we still haven't gone back to our practices pre-pandemic. And that's been a little complicating for us. So we're trying to figure that out. Commemorative. This is a sense where we bring real people, we bring real experiences, we bring real history into the room, into the service. We're not checking individuality at the door. We're bringing it inside, but then naming it, engaging with it in a particular kind of way. And then missional. I think this is really interesting, and like thinking about how not only how our trauma is framed and shaped and healed, but then how are we sent out the door in order to make a difference in the world. Worship ritual is not just for the sake of our internal or our communal congregational life, but is for the sake of the transformation of the world. So any good healing ritual is going to send us back out the door transformed, with a sense that we have something to bring to the world. We have something to share with the world, which in a sense endows us with value and meaning to say, God, no matter what I've been through, no matter what my experience is, God has chosen me, God has chosen us to meet the world in love and compassion and justice. Educational. This is really just helping people understand exactly what is it we're doing here. How do we understand what we're trying to do when we're together? So I'll stop talking. That was a lot. What are some ways you could develop some of these elements in your Sunday assembly, thinking about those 8 different things? How might you bring them more fully, more directly into your Sunday morning assembly?
You got me thinking about confession at the beginning of worship and the oblational, like being all of us. And I love the picture of the baby, because, when I remember when my children were little, they would cry in service, and Jill is also a pastor, so she would be leading her community. I'd be in the community I was serving, and so we'd always have someone else caring for our children, and just the feeling of helplessness, but also just the feeling of the community is with us in that moment, and how we create welcome for everyone in worship, even our little people, and invite them into that experience. I think at Ascension, we have a nursery, but we also have a community that welcomes children. And we started emphasizing that at our early service, and our attendance has grown. And so it's interesting, our early service has been growing past the pre-pandemic numbers. And that's we quarantine off a part of the sanctuary. We have a table for the altar, and we use the piano, and it's our it's kind of like a worship in a large cathedral where you use just a small part of the sanctuary, but everything's intentional. Our cantor really thought things through, but that I never thought of it as oblation. I never thought of that. I thought that was just such a wonderful concept. So thank you for that. It just got me thinking about what's happening here, and then what I experienced when I had little ones that were, and mine were completely out of my control. Bradley knows them, and he knows that I was at their mercy through the whole so
One question I had for all of you is how the prayers of intercession get handled in your communities, because I think that is a really powerful place for much of this work to be done. And I think a lot of us probably don't invest as much time in that as we might. I should speak for myself at Gloria Dei, that we fall into the Sundays and seasons models too often, just relying on sort of general intercessions as good enough. But I wonder if any of you have other things that you do or have thought about during that time.
I know that as Synod staff and traveling all over the Synod, worshiping with different congregations, it doesn't happen very often, but when the congregation has taken the time to write their own prayers, it always seems like deeper. It hits me in a deeper place. Not that, I mean, somebody wrote the prayers that we all use in Sundays and Seasons, but they seem so rote. And so when I know that someone has taken the time to go deeper, to spend time on those prayers, always makes me feel like they're, in some way, they're holier, or I feel a deeper connection to the gathered congregation at those times. So I really wish, and I know that when I was at Nativity, most of the time we just did the ones that came from Sundays and Seasons because it was easier and people were intimidated by writing prayers. But I really wish I had pushed a little bit more, to say, come on, you can do it. Anybody can learn how to write prayers. You pray, just learn how to write them and share them, but, and I'm not sure where it would fall, but I was thinking about this earlier, the, that sense of gathering together and praying and holding each other in a place where if I show up to worship and I can't pray because I'm emotionally distraught, or I can't participate in worship, but the people around me do and lift me up in that process, that is the healing power of that is just amazing. And we do that for each other so many times. I'm not sure which one of those categories it would fall in, but I know that is, to me, that is ritual that is incredibly healing, because I've been receptive, or I have received it, as well as been part of, offering it to other people. So, but I'll hush now.
Well, I know on our staff here, we try really hard not to write the prayers out in advance. We may have a basic outline, like I want to be sure to mention this and mention this and mention this, but we try really hard not to write those prayers out so that they come more from the heart. And I find sometimes I'll end doing the intercessory prayers and I've got a little tear in my eye because it's something spoken through me. And I think, to me, that's when liturgy is done well, when it comes from the heart. Because what I hear a lot of times, just read through it and as if you're reading the phone book. And to me, that's where it goes south. So I like what Patty's saying too, because a lot of times we'll have people submit petitions that they want. In fact, the people who are worship assistants, we say, we want you to add in your own petitions. We know when we do it that style in our traditional. When we do our more contemporary, it's more all just from the heart. But I think that's a good thing to think about, is that it needs to be something that also includes times of silence for people who can't give voice to their prayer during the service. We like to do that too. So just a thought.
We, in our context, when I first got to this church, I wrote all the prayers of the people. And then over time, my colleagues and I shared that responsibility. And then when COVID hit, there was just, and everything else in our particular context, there was just too much. So I said, I created a little, how you might consider writing the prayers of the people, and then invited, 15 households to consider it. And they started this rotation of sharing the responsibility. And I never plan to take it back, by the way. No matter how endemic we get, that's going to live with the congregation from now on. But one of the things that strikes me as somebody who used to be the primary voice in that portion of the liturgy is that by having different writers, we hear what lingers, like what's lingering from traumatic experiences, what's lingering from moments of celebration, what are the questions that are lingering in a particular person. And it allows for like that, the diversity of what's actually represented in the room to emerge in a powerful way. So for us, I think, oh, wow, this person is bringing that into this space. And we get a moment to hold that with them. Or so, and you know what I'm after? I'm not being very clear, but that's one of the powerful things that's kind of emerged just in the last couple.
At Gloria Dei, we're just, our room is not situated in a way that people can pray out loud on their own and be heard by others. It's just the room is too big, but wanted to create a sense of shared communal experience around the prayers of intercession. So now our practice is during the last verse of the hymn of the day, the cross, the assisting minister, and the presiding minister move into the center of the assembly, which causes everyone to turn and face each other. Because we're very much, straight pews looking forward. And so trying to create a sense of community in a space like that was challenging because it kept us in our own little personal spaces in the pews. But by having to turn and face each other, I think we've created a better sense of connection during that part of the service, a better sense maybe of praying together. Any other thoughts or ideas people have related to what those categories and how might we live into them more fully?
And the charismatic idea of bringing our story into God's story, our worship team is beginning to plan worship services in terms of content and using the day, using the lectionary and lessons and starting to think about what is the Holy Spirit saying to our community. That's sort of the magic question that we're asking as we encounter that. And it creates and develops excitement around the development of worship and a sense of anticipation for what we're going to experience. Sort of on your prayers of the people idea, my previous community, we had a group of writers that would write daily devotionals that grew out of our weekly themes. They want to start that here, but that takes a long time to develop those writers and that as well. But that idea of bringing our story into God's story, that God's with us in our midst all week, and the liturgy is a reminder, is that kind of living reminder of that, where we get that on Sunday, but it can linger with us all week as well.
We had writers when I was at St. John's. Each week, someone different wrote the prayers, which was wonderful. And then sometimes, surprising, we'll say that, what got plopped into the prayers or how it was done. But I remember even that was a great experience for me, though, of letting go and letting others name their experience and pray. You know, it didn't always fit how I would do it. And in the end, that was good. That was kind of good for me to let that go, to give it away. And then I was, like you, Ingrid, I was happy not to then have that responsibility. Somebody else got to do it. I remember one particular one where one of the responses again and again was, "We are gods," which the prayer person had an apostrophe there, but many people did not hear that apostrophe in the prayer and just heard this prayer leader regularly saying, "We are gods, we are gods." And it created really a wonderful conversation then about language and, you know, how language is not only spoken, but how language is heard by others, you know, who come from a different grammatical, you know, standpoint on the liturgy. I think we're kind of about out of time. I just wanted to sort of, in conclusion, talk about one moment in the liturgy that I think is paradigmatic for this. And that's in what the old-fashioned language was the fraction, which is when the bread was broken. And I remember in seminary being taught, don't break the bread during the words of institution. That's not the right place to break the bread. But it comes, the ancient Jewish pattern is taking, blessing, breaking, sharing. That's the archaeology of the great Thanksgiving. And this, so that the breaking should have its own kind of moment, which comes at the end of the Eucharistic prayer, when at the elevation you lift it up and then it's broken for the assembly. And Gordon Lathrop always makes the point that every faithful symbol has to be broken somehow. And then that bread is shared. And to me, that is symbolic of what we've been talking about, is that we gather and there's something in all of us that is broken. But the symbol, it doesn't lead us to despair, but actually leads into hope and into sharing for the sake of the world. So that breaking is a really powerful symbol for what we bring and then what we take into the world. And I've always thought about that moment as a powerful moment. A lot of people don't even do it, but I've always wanted to hold on to it and have language, some language that goes to it. So an old-fashioned thing was holy things for holy people. And then the assembly would make a counter argument to say, oh no, one is holy, one is Lord Jesus Christ to the glory of God the Father, is the traditional response. I tried that once in assembly. It didn't make any sense to people. They're like, what? I don't know. So that kind of got shelved. But now we say, reveal yourself to us in the breaking of the bread, and the people respond, make us one body broken for the world. And so like in that moment, there's Christ is revealed and it acknowledges our brokenness and then leads us into the world. So I'll just end kind of with that breaking moment as something to think about. Any last words or comments or?
Bradley, I'll just share this. So for atonement, we've gone back and forth from actually people writing the prayers to the pastor writing it, or using the the standard prayers that are published. And when individuals actually wrote and said the prayers, the concern was kind of what you mentioned. You get different versions of it, and some people can like really pray, and we could be there for 10 minutes whenever whenever the Spirit told them they had said enough. So, and I think that's the reason why we kind of went back to using the standard prayers. But so, and Ingrid, you said something about, I think you met with those 15 people and kind of gave them some general guidelines. And so I could see that piece perhaps working and helping establish some boundaries around, how long the prayer should last. So.
Thank you so much, Bradley and Ingrid, for all of this wisdom that you have shared with us and your time on this Saturday morning. This will be recorded, so anybody who is, once Michael gets all that taken care of, we'll figure out, how about do people go to accessing that, Michael, when it's done?
Everybody who registered will get a link. It'll also reside on our YouTube channel, so anybody could just go to our YouTube channel and search for it there as well.
Okay, great. And also, one thing I did promise you that Pastor Matt and Pastor Jay would put their email in the chat, so we would have that if you are interested in. Pastor Jay had done the growth groups, and Pastor Matt engaging the community, both of which are wonderful presentations, and we have heard them, but they both sort of ask for more questions and involvement as well. So thank you. Thank you all so much. This has been a wonderful opportunity to get together, and the questions have been great. The conversation has been great. So we thank you for your time, and we thank you for all of your gathered time as you have spent time with us this Saturday morning, and go with God and enjoy your afternoon.